Hello there and welcome to Black Jackal Gaming. Now that we're well past the midpoint of 10th edition, we're going to take a look at what's gone a little bit wrong so far, what's not quite worked out as they planned. So it did start out strong out of the gate. The indexes were mostly well received by the gaming community, although there was a couple of incredibly strong indexes. The keywords have really helped things. I think it was a good idea to bring them in. But there is far too much bloat in the edition. It's probably been the most bloated edition we've had thus far. They've tried to balance this with simplifying certain sections of the game, but this has left a quite cookie cutter list creation. And with the amount of detachments and bloat, this has led to a lack of internal balance within codexes. So let's take a look at the 10 things that I think that hasn't really worked out. First up, we got terrain. I think due to the lethality of the game being way too high and GW attempting to combat this by minimizing firing lanes, this has led to a substantial amount of terrain required for a tabletop. There's barely an inch that isn't covered by a ruin. This means that the cost involved to getting into 40k is much higher because a lot of the terrain kits, especially if you're getting them from GW, are incredibly high. And especially when you begin with, it leads to feel bad situations where you haven't put enough terrain on the board and some armies have been decimated in turn one. Something they really need to focus on the next edition to bring down lethality so we can have some more interesting boards that are more sparsely populated. And because of this, we do have relatively boring table setups. If you look across a lot of the tournament scene, there's the same table setups that I've just repeated over and over, including GW's templates, where you're just getting a substantial amount of ruins that are sitting on Perspex templates, taking up a lot of the space. And it just generally looks like a mix of randomly placed buildings and ruins to try and minimize firing lanes, rather than attempting to tell a story, then looking like a realistic tabletop battle. There's been a lack of engagement with terrain because they just pretty much put everything given it the benefits of terrain, so you do get that +1 to your save. Because there's not really much variation, we've lost a lot of the different types of terrain that we had in the likes of 9th edition, where you did have debuffs where you had minuses to movement from going over certain smaller types of terrain, such as craters and the likes of those, and rubble, which they're there just for decoration now, but making tabletops even look more cluttered. And you had the dense terrain, which give you a -1 to hit, so you had a little bit more interaction with where you're going to put the tabletop terrain, how it's going to impact your movement in the game, how it's going to impact the tactics that you want to utilize during the game, rather than all terrain being pretty much the same. Now, we did have obscuring still in 9th edition, and that's essentially what we do have now with the ruins, but you are more likely to get the buff from it. But it just makes it a little bit stale, really. Overwatch, coming out the gate, this was incredibly powerful, especially in the right hands. Adding it to the movement phase rather than just the charge phase meant that you could activate it more often, and increasing the range from what would have previously been the 12 inches to 24 inches has made it quite a mainstay for the entire edition. When we had this out the gate being used by a lot of units that could really utilize this, doing high amounts of damage, and this is out of the sequence that you would usually do, it just created a really imbalanced game. Now, this leads to some units can dictate what happens in the movement phase because they're just that powerful with Overwatch, which can really minimize your impact as the opponent to what you're going to do. It does lead to a couple of feel bad moments where you might be in a position where you can't really achieve much unless you have a unit that you can put forward to try and eat up this Overwatch to bait it out and then move how you want to. Or you're just going to lose quite a powerful unit, especially if you're more an elite army where you don't have many units and you don't have that amount of action monkey units that are there just to score points and screen. It can lead to situations where you are going to struggle just because of this one game mechanic. This is amplified even further with some units having the ability to hit on the 4s and 5s, and with easy access to the likes of lethal hits and sustained hits, you can do a substantial amount of damage using Overwatch. Now, you do have to bear in mind that some abilities are tied to your shooting phase, and often this can lead to situations where gamers unknowingly bend the rules because they don't realize that they can only use certain abilities in their shooting phase and think they can use this in Overwatch because they are shooting. And it can lead to situations where after the game, when you read the rules, you feel a bit hard done by because they've accessed an ability that they shouldn't have had access to. And then if you're a newer player or you're not as skilled as some of your opponents, you do see how powerful Overwatch is, so you try and use it as much as possible. But if you are targeting the wrong unit that doesn't have any buffs associated around this, and you're targeting the wrong type of unit to attack, this can just be a waste of a command point because you are rolling on sixes. So if you're rolling one last cannon hit and you've got to get a six, you're probably wasting your CP there because you're not going to push it through. But if you've got another unit that might be hitting on fives and they've got an inbuilt reroll and they maybe got 10 attacks, well, you're going to be pushing through hits there, especially if you've got access to lethal and sustained hits. Well, it wouldn't be 10th edition without the index detachments. Now, the disappointing thing about the index detachments, for the most part, they are one of the strongest or second strongest detachment in the codex. Now, I understand why they did this, because they want the index detachments to be quite strong, because some people will be having them for 18 months, 2 years, although they have given a couple of armies additional detachments just to hide them over. But this has led to a couple of stale codex releases where the codex comes out and you look and go, oh, the most interesting and fun way to play and the most powerful way is the one I've already been playing for 18 months, which isn't a very good way to sell codexes, really. And this is especially for codexes that have fewer detachments, or they've got detachments within them that are quite niche. Look at the Tau Codex that came out with just the 4 detachments, with one of them being a Kroot detachment, which was interesting to look at, but had a couple of nerfs hit on it quite early. So then you're in a situation where you're probably just going to use the index detachment because it was the strongest one out. Detachment balance has been a major issue. They've been pretty much left alone post-codex, so when the codex come out, whatever the detachment was, that's what you got for the rest of the edition. This has been happening in 95% of the cases. You've had a couple of detachments that have had a couple of changes to them, usually where they're being nerfed because they've been possibly too strong coming out the gate. You got the likes of the Orc Bully Boys, which was hit hard post-release, which was a bit odd because it was a strong detachment, but it wasn't exactly breaking the game. And there's been other detachments that come out that have been equally problematic, which they haven't really looked at. But what this has led to is that some detachments are just dead on arrival. And if they come out terrible on the codex, they've not been rebalanced and they've been terrible for the entire edition. You've just got to look at the first codex out being Space Marines, where they had the First Company Task Force, which was a pretty dead detachment that's arrived, and we're coming up to almost 2 years later, and it's been completely untouched and isn't played by players because there's absolutely no reason to take that detachment over any of the other detachments. This has been amplified again by Grotmas, with all factions gaining at least one detachment. A lot of these detachments that come out were generally a top tier detachment for the army. They're either the best detachment that they could access, or they were an A tier detachment where you could play it and be very competitive. There was a couple of armies that come out with a bit of a stinker from Grotmas. But when you're looking at your codex, and 2 of your strongest detachments, if not the 2 strongest, are the 3 ones that you got at the start of the edition at Christmas, it makes you think, was it actually that worthwhile picking up the codex? Looking at model releases, this has been the addition of model refreshes rather than new models, which seemed a weird thing to complain about when you look at some of the fantastic new releases that we've had that have been refreshes. You've just got to look at the recent Space Wolves teaser, which we're going to get later in the year. The new Logar model looks absolutely stunning and is going to be a fan favourite, but it would be nice to have more new models as well rather than just refreshes. So some armies have scored quite a few new units. It's quite nice to see. You had the Kroot release for Tau, which was a relatively big release for them. And for Guard, you had the new Kree units. Now, some of these were basically re-releases or refreshes from the old Forge World models, but you did have a fair few in there that were quite new ones as well. But GW's really lent into most codexes just getting a new character and that's it. When you look at the likes of Eldar and Space Marines, they've had substantial refreshes. For Eldar, majority of their aspect worries have now been redone. We did have the Banshees previously, but they've pretty much done all of them, and a lot of the Exarchs for these have been redone as well, and they look fantastic. But it would be nice to get new units as well. Space Marines are going through another phase of having everything redone. So we've had the likes of the Stern Guards, the Terminators, we've got the new Assault Terminators coming, the drop pods just being dropped, and this is all well and good. They're very exciting units. But when our last new unit was in 9th edition, and I'm pretty sure it was just the Desolation Marines, it means that we've gone a good 2 years, really, almost 3 years, where we've just had refreshed kits. What's this led to? A lot of the older gamers that have large collections, it gives them little reason to actually hobby, which is a big part of the game. Because a lot of people aren't going to rebuy a new kit, especially if it doesn't differ that much. Look at the old Stern card kit to the current one. Now, the current one's quite nice, but the old one had a little bit more character. If you've got a couple of squads of Stern Guard fully kitted out, and the rules are quite bare bones for the edition, why would you go through the effort of buying a whole new 2 or 3 kits for this? It only comes in the 5-man kits, even though it can go up to 10 models and a little bit pricey. Why would you go the way to do it if the datasheet isn't making you want to go that far into it? Makes you think maybe the refreshers are there just trying to capture newer players rather than appeal to the older players, which are more likely to go to your third-party websites and stores to pick up the kits for cheaper anyway. Going into 10th edition, they said power levels were gone. Now, we all know this was a lie. They just changed points into power levels because all war gear was free. Now, this felt great at the start of the game because you wasn't paying for war gear, so you could take all your goodies. You didn't have to worry about how to model your units because you could take whatever you wanted. But this leads to list building being quite dull. Now, it did take much longer to build lists in the past. You could build them quite easily as well, but if you're trying to juggle to get the best out of your army, sometimes you were juggling 20, 25 points and you were adding gear here, taking it away there, changing this weapon here to try and get the most out of your list. Now, when you've just got the free upgrades everywhere and the unit costs what it costs, a little bit more dull because you just basically parachute in 50% of your army from a previous list and then add a couple of units and you're pretty much done. This has led to a lot of the lists looking the same, especially in the competitive scene. With how GW's gone about rebalancing units in the game, they've just knocked some by a couple of points. So when you've had a codex out for 2 years, unless there's been a big shift in the meta where you can shift within your codex to maybe go slightly more anti-tank rather than an anti-infantry, it means that your list would generally look the same unless you go out of your way to make it different just for a change. With the way the balancing with the point increases, it actually makes it hard to rework your list without intensive surgery. If you've got 3 units and they all go up by 10 points, you've got 30 points to knock off your list. There's nothing in the army that costs that. So you've then got to generally look at what 4 or 5 units can you take out to then bring in maybe 4 different units that do the same. Where previously you lost those 30 points, you go, well, I'll lose Power Fist here, maybe a Heavy Bolter there, maybe a Plasma Gun here, and you can pretty much keep the same list with just a couple of changes to some of the hardware within the units. I think if it does revert to 11th, a lot of people will be happy, but there will be a lot of people in hobby hell as well. If people have absolutely min-maxed their unit and all of a sudden they've got to go out and buy a couple of extra models because they've got loads of models that just got random weapons that now cost too much in this edition, it means they're going to have to spend more money, which is going to put them in a bit of an awkward position. But hey ho, that helps the bottom line for GW, so I wouldn't be surprised if they did revert. Or in the very least, they just made some of the weaker equipment, such as flamers and the likes of those, as an optional freebie, like chainswords as well. But your better equipment, your plasma guns, your power fists, and the likes of those would have a charge increase next to them. That might be the way they go instead. Looking at character balance, it is the addition of characters. Well, that's what so does. You add them to the unit, it makes the unit better. But the problem this led to that if a character is bad, it's not really being readdressed at all in the edition. If it's bad in the codex, probably going to be bad for the entire edition. You might see a slight point decrease the once, but that might be it. We've even seen instances where characters have seen no play whatsoever. And the only way they're being addressed that, they're being given a 5-point deduction, which this is absolutely pointless because a model that's 75, 80, 85 points, putting it down by 5 points, doesn't go from having 0 in your army to 3. It pretty much means it goes from 0 to 0. The only way this is ever beneficial is if all the other units then substantially go up in price. So you've basically got to take this because everything else is well too expensive. I think there's also been an issue where some of the abilities aren't the best on some characters and they're not readdressed at all. You've got the likes of the Apothecary where bringing a model back quite nice in your command phase, but it's such a lethal game that if your unit's targeted, you probably won't have a unit to bring back in the command phase anyway. There was overability of when the unit's wiped on a 2+, he gets the CP. I'm pretty sure everyone would agree with changing that ability to a feel no pain 6+ for the unit. And you'd probably see him taking a hell of a lot more option than almost never. There's another issue where a lot of the character abilities only activate when leading a unit. Sometimes these are just simply lethal hits or access to cheaper stratagems and the likes of those. But the way they're worded means that you have to be attached to the unit for them to activate. So there's some leaders that you might go, well, he's not too bad. I can take him by himself, have him as a sacrificial lamb to throw forward into the meat grinder or do actions. But because their abilities don't activate when they're solo, there's not really a use for them in the game anymore. And when it comes to Elder, the writers of those rules, they love Elder. You can tell every edition they come out, GW can't help themselves. They're just that good. They're generally always broken out the gate, taking multiple nerfs to come down, like in 10th edition. I think it was 3 data balance slates where they had amendments to the rules and the points to bring them in line. It also caused a change to core rules of how Towering operated, Overwatch operated, and Devastating Wounds, just to try and bring them back in line. Now, like I said before, you can tell they really love Eldar, the people that write them, and they give them great rules. They're generally quite thematic. They're a well-balanced faction that are good at everything, which is great, unless you're playing against them. Like always, the codex come out the gate really strong. You'd be hard-pressed to go through all the reviews of the codex and anyone go through and find anything wrong. They come out with every detachment was quite a good detachment. It was either relatively strong to absolutely strong with a great set of stratagems throughout. And they've always got a really good army rule as well. No matter what the edition, you always know they're going to come out with good rules. They've got good units. The data sheets are always good. They always really lean on the army rules and stratagems and enhancements and the likes of those to get the best out of them, to amplify them higher. There's loads of supporting units to send them to the moon. And there's always really cool ways to play them, which is all good. And no one's ever going to complain about that, really. But it'd be nice if that creative writing and power balance would spread out a little bit more evenly to some of the factions. Even some of the elder factions, where when you look at the likes of Harlequins, which haven't had a codex for 2 editions and are basically dead boats floating in space at the moment, or Drakari, which can't find the balance between being absolutely stomping everyone to just a trash faction that really struggles. Be nice if they could take the way they write armies with Eldar and apply that across the game. I think it's safe to say that the bloat is real in this edition. They went with the mantra and the marketing from the outset of simplified, not simple, saying the game was going to be just as complex, but it's going to be easier to play, which was quite a nice thing to hear. But then they ended up giving Space Marines over 20 different detachments to use over multiple supplements. And there's more on the way because we will be getting a Space Wolf supplement as well. So to go from it's a simplified game to all of a sudden Space Marines have a substantial amount of different rules to look into was a little bit misleading. No one's going to argue the keywords were good. Everyone was glad they returned. But then this didn't really need abilities on all units. This was quite bad, I thought, especially when a lot of the abilities were just slightly different keywords, or they were basically just what the keywords were, but they were written slightly differently, which led to some confusion. It's like they didn't have to put such a substantial amount of keywords and abilities on the unit. The keywords should be what makes the units unique, showing how they operate, not giving them keywords and abilities on top. All you've essentially done is taken what we had previously, said this is too complex, there's too many differences in how the rules are writing is leading to confusion, so we're going to simplify it with keywords, but then keep all the abilities there as well. You've just overcomplicated the situation. And then they've noted this later on when you've got the likes of the Tau, where they've split the crisis teams into all different data sheets. So now you've got multiple data sheets for the same unit, but they give them a different weapon layout so they can give them different points based on what their war gear is. So they've pretty much brought the weapon war gear points back. But then they've done this, but then they give them all different abilities as well. So you can look at a crisis unit, it looks very similar to the one next to it, but it's got a completely different set of weapons and abilities and keywords, which just makes it more confusing to keep up. And finally, the combat patrol rules. I think everyone would agree that it's a good idea to have a solid entry point into 40k. where it's relatively cheap to get into. You've got a lower points value and it's easy just to pick up a list and go with it, but it's not being quite implemented as well as it should be. There's different data sheets within the Combat Patrol, then you get into 40k, so this really makes it difficult for people to transition. And the boxes are not always on the shelf that long. Sometimes they've only got a 12-month shelf life, and they mix and match so often. And there's a substantial difference to the amount of models or the capabilities that you get in the box or the amount of characters. So it makes games quite one-sided, really, when you look at them, where some Combat Patrols just are going to really struggle into other Combat Patrols because there's not much balance there. They really should have just looked at putting out multiple lists of PDFs on the website where this army has these 5 to 10 different lists that can be used in the Combat Patrol, linking to where you can purchase the models from, potentially keeping them limited in the amount of units that you have in them, rather than having a box that's geared toward monetary value within the box rather than gameplay. This lets you make it a little bit more thematic, keep it in line with the core rules and the data updates as well, rather than having a Combat Patrol that came out 2 years ago where the rules are just completely out of date and operate so differently to how they do in 40k. Just makes the onboarding, as the marketing term they like to use, much more difficult for new players, where they might pick up Combat Patrol, have a couple of games, quite fun, and then they pick up another one, go to play, say, a 750 point game. All of a sudden, the rules are all different and it's really difficult. And then they got a feel bad moment where they didn't have a good game. It was confusing. They get mixed up with rules that no longer exist in this version of the game. And it puts them off playing games in the future. What do you think? Is there other things in 10th edition that have not quite gone as you would hoped? Or any of the points that I've raised that you feel are actually good things that's happened in the game? Leave a comment below. If you liked the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to see all future content. Take it easy. I'll see you next time.